The first scent hitting your nostrils is ammonia. Your morning starts with a chamber pot, though not one belonging to the Queen. Stop kidding yourself. You're nowhere near that significant. This particular vessel serves her lady-in-waiting, and scrubbing it spotless falls to you so the palace stops reeking like an exposed cesspool. Kneeling there, freezing stone cutting into your flesh, you're erasing what historical records conveniently omit. Overhead, crystal fixtures sparkle, expensive porcelain awaits the morning meal, and dresses costing more than your existence hang prepared for their appearance. Here below, your ashes, perspiration and quietness. Still, without your presence, the hosiery remains unwashed. The game bird never reaches the royal dining table, and the dazzling spectacle of royalty crumbles before morning arrives. Well done. You're unseen, yet essential. Before entering the realm of Victorian palace employment tonight, a brief mention. Should you prefer hearing these narratives advertisement-free, offline, and including an exclusive behind-the-scenes episode, you'll discover the ad-free collection referenced in the description and pinned comment. Now relax, breathe gently, and let's navigate the cramped hallways of palace existence together. Though first, if you're experiencing this without subscribing, consider yourself among these overlooked servants. Anonymous, wiped from recollection. That defines you. To the algorithm. Fight against invisibility. Subscribe and share with me. What hour is it in your location presently? You're not solitary here. Actually, you belong to an army numbering in the thousands. Still, you experience isolation, because serving in a Victorian palace meant inhabiting the darkness. Scholars prefer documenting monarchs, queens and officials, the identities carved into stone, but they seldom document you, the individual polishing footwear, transporting coal or removing lint from a velvet garment. That doesn't diminish your significance. Without your contribution, the palace ceases functioning. Without your effort, the facade of royal magnificence dissolves before reaching the dining chamber. And what a facade it represented. Picture the scene overhead. Silk garments swishing, crystal chandeliers blazing with countless beeswax tapers. Coaches arriving in a procession of prosperity. Now picture the mechanism underneath it. That mechanism is your body. It's the chime awakening you at 5 in the morning, the never-ending passages where you transport platters, the washing that never dries quickly enough in England's moist climate. The Victorian palace essentially functioned as a luxury accommodation operated by a concealed workforce, and you occupy the lowest position on that hierarchy. How many servants were required to maintain a royal palace's operation? Well, at peak capacity, Buckingham Palace independently employed beyond 1,000. Correct, 1,000. That's a modest community, dedicated exclusively to dusting, scrubbing, washing, preparing food, shining, transporting, attending, and, when necessary, standing absolutely motionless in uniform to appear ornamental. It wasn't merely the obvious positions like footmen and housemaids. The personnel roster could sound like a peculiar legend. Rat catchers, ice keepers, mole takers, confectioners, and even a gentleman employed exclusively to wind the palace timepieces. Picture devoting your complete profession to ensuring the royal clocks ticked accurately. And should you think, well, that seems simple, recall this was Victorian Britain. There existed over 400 clocks throughout the palace. You'd have to exist by the chime, travelling from chamber to chamber, winding key in hand, ensuring the facade of royal timeliness remained unbroken. Overseeing all this splendour sat the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward, and the Master of the Horsemen of Noble Birth, who supervised enormous departments as if commanding kingdoms inside kingdoms. But you don't answer to them. You're positioned too low on the hierarchy for that. You receive instructions from the butler or perhaps the housekeeper who receives instructions from another person who receives instructions from another person until, like enchantment, your exhausting labour produces the Queen's broth being sufficiently warm and her gloves being sufficiently pristine. This unseen command structure was inflexible. A scullery maid understood her station exactly as the head cook understood his. To venture beyond it meant social destruction. Even amongst servants, there existed a hierarchy sufficiently sharp to slice crystal. Footmen dismissed kitchen boys, maids regarded scullions with disdain. Still, when called by the chime, you all responded identically. Ah, correct, the chimes. Visualize it. A lengthy panel suspended with numerous wires, each linking to a separate chamber. When a royal digit tugged the rope overhead, a chime would clatter below, and one of you, whichever was nearest, would rush to comply. Every clang signified a fresh directive. Shine the silverware, retrieve the coal, ready the bathing water, tighten the corset, ignite the hearth, deliver the correspondence, or, indeed, scrub the chamber pot. You didn't determine when to shift, consume food, or even inhale freely. The chimes controlled your existence. And here's the section you'll appreciate. You weren't meant to be visible unless completely necessary. The objective was invisibility. Should a royal enter a chamber, you departed. Should they ring the chime, you materialized silently, performed your obligation and disappeared like vapour. The Victorian palace desired to operate as if through enchantment, and you represented the magic performance, available but never recognised. You might think, well, at minimum the compensation made it worthwhile. No, the compensation was minimal, occasionally laughable, scarcely sufficient to sustain body and spirit united. A footman might receive 20 to 40 annually, which sounds like wealth, until you discover he had to purchase his own uniform from it. A scullery maid received even less, and she didn't receive the advantage of uniform or gratuities from noble visitors. You laboured for status, not riches. The sort of status that allowed your mother to boast that her daughter polished utensils in a palace while you coughed yourself toward death in the washing steam and the hours, sunrise to sunset, occasionally longer. Servants inhabited a realm where time wasn't calculated in hours, but in assignments. Ignite the hearths, darken the grates, heat the water, flatten the linens, deliver the evening meal, clean everything afterward, collapse, and repeat it tomorrow. There was no concept of a break. Even Sundays contained obligations, plus the requirement of chapel participation, because nothing expresses rest like dragging yourself into religious service after 14 hours of toil. What retained people here then? For some, it represented survival. For others, it represented the slim possibility that faithful employment might create opportunities. A valet might accompany his employer overseas. A lady's maid might inherit garments too elegant for her position. A footman might eventually ascend the servant structure. And yes, some even married upward into improved positions or occasionally attracted the attention of aristocracy. But those represented exceptions, not standards. For most of you, the palace functioned as both workplace and confinement. Here's the contradiction. Overhead, visitors spoke continuously of splendour, luxury and sophistication. But supporting every shimmer of gold decoration was an army of exhausted bodies, yours included. Your existence was blisters and coal powder, while overhead they discussed the appropriate angle of a soup utensil. And this represents the invisible army you've recently entered. Nobody observes you, nobody appreciates you. Still, every utensil cleaned, every taper ignited, every polished boot belongs to yours. You'd assume a monarch could clean their own utensil. But no, that's your responsibility. So grow accustomed to the sound of the chime. It doesn't acknowledge if you're starving. It doesn't acknowledge if you're exhausted. It doesn't acknowledge if your hands are damaged. It only acknowledges that the performance must continue. And you, whether you accept it or not, are the one preventing the curtain from dropping. The palace sleeps. Chandeliers are extinguished, velvet drapes pulled, and the magnificent halls resonate with quietness. But you don't receive quietness. You receive the grinding of boots on stone and the clattering of coal containers in the darkness. 5 o'clock in the morning marks when your workday commences. The royals remain dreaming, nestled into feather bedding. You, conversely, are staggering from a breezy attic chamber or a narrow bed in the servants' quarters, where the bedding is barely more than a sack of hay. If you're fortunate, you rested at all. Your duty yesterday may have concluded past midnight. The initial assignment, hearths. Always the hearths. The palace may appear like a sparkling jewellery container from outside, but it's also a breezy brick icebox. Every single fireplace, grate and heating device must be ignited before anyone overhead dares exit their chambers. That requires hauling coal up staircases that appear infinite, balancing heavy containers against your torso as powder suffocates your breathing. Your hands throb, your shoulders flame. And all you've accomplished thus far is ensuring someone else's digits won't feel chilled. Naturally, you're not solitary in this suffering. The scullery boy is already conscious, sleeves raised, elbows submerged in greasy cookware that never appears to become pristine. Kitchen housemaids are hunched over cutting surfaces, blades flashing in the flicker of oil lanterns. They'll occupy the complete day peeling, cutting, heating and scrubbing, only to surrender hours afterward, smelling of onions and residue. And then there's you, staggering overhead with your coal containers, praying you don't scatter a single piece because squandered coal signifies squandered earnings. Dismiss thoughts of breakfast. If you manage to steal a fragment of stale bread before your subsequent assignment, consider yourself fortunate. Tea? Not for you. That steaming vessel of tea is allocated for overhead. You'll consume weak, reused leaves. If anything whatsoever, this isn't the type of breakfast in the palace you might have envisioned when you initially dreamed of royal employment. By now, the bellboard is twitching. You hear it clatter, then again, then again. Each tug of a rope overhead signifies another requirement below. Someone desires hot water. Someone else desires their boots darkened. And naturally, the kitchen already requires more coal for the heating devices. You don't operate the palace. You're simply fuel for it, exactly like the coal you transport. Imagine this routine stretched across numerous servants, chambermaids transporting jugs of water, hallboys sweeping staircases, housemaids removing bedding and beating powder from carpets. Each of them shifts like mechanisms, trained not to be observed. To the royal household, beds are magically arranged, hearths magically ignited, food magically prepared. But you understand the reality. This isn't enchantment. This is 5 a.m. drudgery powered by aching backs and vacant stomachs. There's no splendour in these early hours. You labour in quietness because conversation squanders time and sound risks observation. Your uniform is plain, your apron rigid with starch, your footwear worn thin from ascending. Still, invisibility is part of the position description. If a royal happens to rise early and glimpse you, it's regarded a failure. You're intended to dissolve into walls, a shadow that organises and cleans but never inhales too audibly. Some scholars describe this the concealed mechanism of the palace. That's charitable. It feels less like mechanism and more like servitude disguised as obligation. You ignite hearth after hearth, transport container after container, scrub cookware after cookware. And exactly when you believe you finished, a chime rings again. There's always another hearth to ignite, another coal container to transport. And recall, this is merely the beginning of your day. The royals haven't even stirred yet. When they finally rise, the actual parade of requirements will commence. Dressing robes, breakfasts, newspaper distributions, fresh bedding, coaches prepared. If you're exhausted now, unfortunate, you still have 14 hours remaining. Do you ever pause and think while dragging that container how absurd this all is? Hundreds of capable-bodied men and women rising in the darkness so that one household doesn't have to sense the chill of a stone surface under their digits. You'd assume a monarch could at minimum ignite their own hearth. But no, that's your responsibility. So you continue forward, You continue forward because the palace requires it. Because the chimes won't cease ringing. Because bread fragments, coal powder, and the throbbing rhythm of labour have become your existence. 5 in the morning is only the beginning. The palace is conscious now. Not with the sound of royalty, not yet, but with the clanging, relentless chatter of chimes. If you believed church bells were sacred, wait until you encounter the true deities of your existence. The bellboard, you've observed it, haven't you? A lengthy wooden structure suspended on the wall in the servants' chamber, wires trailing like vessels through the plaster, each ending in a small metal chime. Overhead, every chamber has its rope. Tug the rope, and here below, a chime jumps, clinks, and vibrates. And when it shifts, you shift. No questions, no hesitations. The chime rings and your body complies to you. The bellboard is less a piece of timber and more a tyrant. It governs your day, your meals, your rest, even your thoughts. You don't determine when to walk across the passage. The chime does. You don't determine when to place down the platter or tie the boot. The chime does. If a royal so much as sneezes, chances are a chime rings to call you with a cloth. It's a peculiar symphony. One chime might sound like a sharp little chirp, another like a lazy clatter. After a while you learn to identify them without looking. Ah, that's the yellow receiving room, you think, or that's the prince's changing chamber. You hear them even in your slumber. Sometimes, when no chime is ringing at all, you swear you still hear the faint metallic resonance. Now imagine this. Numerous chimes clattering in rapid succession. Overhead, the household prepares for breakfast. One desires hot water, another desires a newspaper retrieved, another decides their boots aren't glossy enough. The panel shivers like a nervous creature. Chimes bouncing, wires trembling, as if the palace itself is requiring your compliance. So you rush. You all rush. A housemaid hurries up the rear stairs with fresh bedding. A footman marches down the passage, balancing a silver platter. A scullery maid nearly drops a pitcher of steaming water as she darts past. Nobody collides because everyone understands their position. It's a dance of invisibility, timed flawlessly to the chimes. Naturally, the actual trick of the chime system is that you're never intended to be observed unless called. You're supposed to materialize from nowhere, accomplish the directive, and dissolve again. If the queen tugs her rope, you materialize like a phantom, smooth her garment, and retreat back into the darkness. If a visitor rings, you bow, deliver what they desire, and evaporate. You are not a person with pains and thoughts. You are the human extension of a chime. And here's the comedy of it all. The royals didn't even have to communicate. The complete hierarchy of authority could be handled by a tiny flick of a wrist. Ring a chime, and down you come, like Pavlov's canine. Your existence is basically one extended game of hide and seek, except you never hide, and they never seek. They simply ring. There were regulations, naturally. If the king's chime rang, it took precedence over everyone else's. If 2 chimes rang simultaneously, the higher servant in status responded first. And heaven assist you if you answered a chime too sluggishly. There was no faster way to find yourself scolded, demoted, or terminated than to let a chime clatter unanswered for more than a minute. Now picture the sensory tempest. The clangs resonate through the servants' chamber, bouncing off stone walls. Somewhere overhead, footsteps creak below the grinding of chairs, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of kettles, and always, always the chimes. It's a realm that never sits still, the contradiction. The chimes were installed to make the palace operate more efficiently, to bring structure to disorder. But for you, they brought only more disorder. A single morning might witness you rush from the scullery to the grand staircase 6 times. The system was efficient for them. Not for you. For you, it was exhaustion disguised as obligation. Some servants despised the chimes with a passion. Others learned to exist by them. A few even discovered humour in it, joking that one day they'd answer a chime with nothing more than a mirror so the royals could observe just how absurd they looked, calling human beings as if they were mechanical playthings. But you don't dare joke. You simply rush. Your hands are blistered from transporting coal, your apron is moist with perspiration, and your stomach rumbles with hunger. The chimes don't acknowledge. The chimes never acknowledge. They only acknowledge that the palace remains spotless, flawless, perfect. And so you exist by the bell board. Its small wires connect you to every corner of the palace, binding your body to the whims of people who will never understand your identity. You can dismiss breakfast, dismiss rest, dismiss any notion of free choice, because when the chime rings, you belong to someone else. So remember this. In the Victorian palace, you are not in control of your own time. The chime is. It's the first sound you hear in the morning, and often the final sound at night. And tomorrow, when you drag yourself from bed at 5 in the morning again, you'll repeat it all over, waiting for the first clang to tell you where to go and what to accomplish. The palace may dazzle the realm overhead, but below, it's nothing more than a dictatorship of chimes. Overhead, there are silks, satins, lace, and pearls. Below, there is you, tied into an apron that smells faintly of starch and yesterday's perspiration. That is the great division of palace existence. Elegance at the top, plainness at the bottom. You might think uniforms were created to make servants appear respectable. Incorrect. They were created to make you identifiable and invisible simultaneously. You wear uniform that marks you out as personnel, so no visitor ever mistakes you for one of them, but also plain enough to fade into the wallpaper when not required. You are ornamental when called, but otherwise you're scenery. Your apron is not stitched from satin or embroidered with gold. It's coarse linen bleached until rigid, tied around your waist like a reminder that you are here to labour. Still, even this simple garment had regulations. Aprons had to be spotless. Creased aprons meant punishment. Soiled aprons meant disgrace. You might occupy your morning scrubbing chamber pots or transporting residue. But heaven forbid the Queen's butler catches you with a dirty tie at your waist. Contrast this with overhead, where discussions about diamonds could consume an afternoon. Should the Queen wear the crown with emeralds, or the one with sapphires? Should the garment be trimmed with lace or with ermine? Your apron smells of starch and perspiration, while overhead someone is agonising over which jewel best reflects imperial power. At minimum, your choices are simple. Wear the apron or lose your position. Now there were roles where uniforms did edge toward the spectacular. Footmen, particularly, were dressed like ornamental furniture. Gold-braided coats, powdered wigs, buckled footwear. They were supposed to impress visiting visitors, to stand like glossy tin soldiers at the edge of the royal dining chamber. But don't be deceived. The footman might appear dazzling in crimson velvet, but his pockets were still vacant. The uniform belonged to the palace, not to him, and he paid for it from his earnings. His uniform wasn't a privilege, it was a financial snare. Compare that to women's roles, especially dressers and laundresses. One of the most famous was Mrs. Thielke, dresser to Queen Charlotte. She inhabited her existence surrounded by elegance, but never wore it herself. She handed garments to the Queen in the appropriate sequence, powdered her wigs, fastened her lace, and quietly stood in the background while the monarch transformed into a walking symbol of empire. Without Mrs. Thielke, the Queen would have struggled to dress herself, yet Mrs. Thielke wore little more than a serviceable garment, a modest cap, and yes, the eternal apron, and that apron carried its own weight of symbolism. It wasn't merely cloth, it was a barrier between you and them, between employment and position. No matter how close you stood to the Queen, no matter if your hands touched the very lace that brushed the royal flesh, the apron marked you as different, separate, beneath. Naturally, aprons were practical too. They caught spills, soot, flour, grease and powder, all of which clung to you like shadows of the labour you performed. If you laboured in the washing room, it reeked of soap and vapour. If you laboured in the kitchen, it smelled of roasting meat and onion peels. If you laboured as a housemaid, it carried the faint scent of polish and residues. The apron was a diary of your toil, written in marks. And then there were corsets. Thankfully, servants didn't have to endure whalebone structures cinched so firmly they left bruises on the ribs. You didn't have time for that nonsense. You needed to shift, bend, scrub, and transport. At minimum, aprons don't need whalebone corsets. Small mercies. Still, you did have to tie yourself into rigid stays or bodices. Firm enough to appear presentable, loose enough not to faint while transporting water. Uniforms weren't merely clothing. They were instruments of discipline. A creased cuff or crooked cap could draw the anger of the housekeeper or butler. Appear sloppy, and you might be accused of laziness. Appear too elegant, and you might be accused of vanity. Servants inhabited a peculiar middle space, always neat, never flashy, always pristine, never comfortable. Meanwhile, overhead, garments told stories of prosperity and position. Queen Charlotte's dresses, independently, could take hours to assemble, with layers of lace, whalebone and embroidery stitched with her initials. Every inch of fabric screamed authority. Still supporting each dress was an army of invisible hands. Seamstresses, laundresses and dressers like Mrs. Thielke, whose toil held the empire united one button at a time. Think about the absurdity for a moment. Overhead, one woman fusses over the sparkle of her crown. Below, another woman, perhaps you, is scrubbing that woman's apron because a smudge of soot landed on it during the morning hearth igniting. Both assignments are treated with the same urgency. One is about diamonds, the other is about dirt. Both, apparently, are crucial to the palace. So when you tie on your apron in the morning, remember this. You're not simply protecting your garment from grime. You're tying on your identity, your station in the invisible structure of the palace. You're announcing to the realm, I am here to serve, to transport, to clean, and to dissolve when the chime rings. Still, for all its starch and perspiration, the apron was oddly liberating compared to the cages of silk. Overhead, while the queen was stitched into a garment she could barely sit down in, you could at minimum bend your knees. While a maid of honour floated around in a whalebone skirt, unable to cross her arms, you had freedom of movement even if it signified freedom only to scrub another surface. So yes, your apron might never sparkle in candlelight, it might never command the gaze of foreign ambassadors, but it was honest. It told the reality. It said, this is labour, not theatre. And in a palace where appearances governed, that reality was rare. And if you're still experiencing this without subscribing, well, then you're treating this channel the same way the royals treated their servants. Invisible until required, forgotten the moment you dissolve. Don't be that cruel. Subscribe. If you believed igniting hearths and transporting coal was difficult, wait until you encounter the true tyrant of palace existence. The washing room. Dismiss the romantic image of garments swishing elegantly down marble staircases. Each of those garments was a maintenance catastrophe. Silk that had to be brushed, lace that had to be hand-cleaned, velvet that couldn't be folded for fear of creasing. And who maintained it all immaculate? Not the queen, not the ladies in waiting. It was you. Or more accurately, the battalion of laundresses heating, scrubbing, starching and pressing from sunrise until their backs surrendered. Step into the washing chamber with me. It is not glamorous. It is heated, moist and suffocating. The atmosphere is thick with vapour from copper containers bubbling over timber hearths. The scent, a mixture of wet linen, lye, soap and perspiration. You can hardly inhale, still the chamber never rests. There are piles of linens, heaps of garments, stacks of shirts, and under it all, the endless drip of dirty water splashing against stone. You bend over a container, your arms plunged into heating water. Residue and lye sting your flesh until it cracks. You scrub, wring, rinse and repeat, day after day. The Queen's handkerchiefs, the King's hosiery, the maids' caps, each one must be flawlessly white, flawlessly pristine, flawlessly pressed. No creases, no marks, no excuses. Dismiss perfume. The Queen smells of the toil of 12 laundresses heating water for hours. Every drop of lavender water sprinkled on her garments is only masking the stench of endless scalding containers below stairs. And don't imagine for a moment that this was merely washing. This was back-breaking science. To maintain lace rigid, you had to soak it in starch made from wheat or potatoes, then flatten it with irons heated in the hearth. Those irons weighed like solid metal blocks. Set one down carelessly, and soot would streak the fabric. Press too firmly, and the cloth burned black. The difference between perfection and ruin was seconds. Think about the royal linens. Weekly they needed stripping, boiling, bleaching and stretching across massive wooden frames. Buckingham Palace sheets could overflow a warehouse. Each required hours of hand scrubbing, and before you finished one batch, another arrived. The work never stopped, and meanwhile you sweated through layers of rough fabric. Steam soaked your apron until it dripped. Damp heat frizzed your hair, water wrinkled your skin, and smoke from the fires made your lungs burn. Many laundresses died early, not from laziness, but from lungs destroyed by years of breathing ash and chemical vapours. Hierarchy existed even in this hell. The head laundress made decent money and received fair allowances for soap, starch and alum. Beneath her stood an army of women, temporary workers who came and left, often earning pennies, dragging wet fabric heavier than a full-grown man. No salary for them, just blisters, coughs, and if fortune smiled, stale bread. Strangely, laundry work carried prestige because handling the monarch's clothing meant proximity to the body, though never the person. The laundries touched garments worn against bare skin, washed sheets bearing the royal form and maintained them spotlessly. This was invisible intimacy, yet the laundress herself remained unacknowledged. You might wash a slip that touched the Queen's body, but you'd never be allowed to meet her gaze. Still, the work continued endlessly. Winter meant finding ways to dry clothes in humid air. Summer brought battles with flies and mould. Rain destroyed drying schedules. Fires died out. Soap cost too much. Starch proved unpredictable. Yet when the Queen appeared in a gown crisp with lace and fresh as dawn, everyone praised her grace. Nobody considered you. Eyes bloodshot. Steam scarred, standing waist-deep in sudsy water. There's brutal poetry in it. Upstairs, royals existed in silk fantasies. Downstairs, you existed in steam torment. Their beauty relied completely on your suffering. They appeared flawless because you looked destroyed. Naturally, your shift didn't finish when the laundry was dried and ironed. By the time you collapsed onto your cot, hands torn and body screaming, the bell could ring again, another dress soiled, another blouse dirtied, another emergency wash required of you. Cleanliness never lasted. Filth always returned. So when picturing palace existence, don't imagine only the sparkle of gems or the rustle of lace. Imagine the sweat falling into a boiling vat. Imagine the sizzle of a hot iron meeting linen. Imagine your apron drenched with steam and your lungs burning from smoke. That was reality beneath the beauty. The palace might have gleamed above, but below it stank of soap and suffering. Watch your step now. The laundry was brutal, but the kitchens are inferno, not symbolic inferno, actual, suffocating, smoky, sweat-drenched inferno. The palace kitchens were the pulsing core of royal existence. They never ceased, dawn through past midnight. Fires blazed in enormous brick hearths, spits rotated constantly, and knives never stopped. The odour alone overwhelmed. Roasting flesh, bubbling broths, burning fat, spilled beer and smoke so dense it lined your throat. You stand there, apron already wet, shoulders throbbing as you hold the long shaft of a spit. On it, a venison haunch slowly rotates, juices falling into the flames. Your face sweats from the heat. Your back hurts from rotating spits of meat you'll never eat, and your belly rumbles at the contradiction. The banquet sits inches from your face, but your meal will be remnants at best. Above you, the royals demand nothing short of excellence. A single strand in a plate. Catastrophe. A broth too seasoned. Shame. Meanwhile, downstairs, you've already cut your finger once, burned your wrist twice, and dumped hot fat onto your feet. Nobody notices. Wounds are expected. Wrap it fast, continue working, or face termination. The magnitude of everything is stunning. Consider Christmas dinner at your table. Turkey, stuffing, perhaps a pie. Now increase that by 70. A royal feast might demand 70 plates per course, all displayed simultaneously. Plates of seafood, roasted fowl, jellied meats, puddings, pies, custards and frozen desserts, arranged not merely for flavour, but for display. And you are one of the unseen hands creating it all. The master cook supervises the madness, shouting directions over the thunder of fire and crash of cookware. Below him, battalions of helpers chop, peel, stir and roast. Scullery girls scrub pans blackened with fat. Kitchen boys haul buckets of water and containers of supplies. Pastry cooks roll dough until their muscles ache. Everyone has a function, every function a ranking. And at the base, you. You spend hours cutting onions, your eyes burning until tears stream down your face. You carry sacks of flour, heavy enough to flatten you if you trip. You bring wood for the fire, water for the pots and pans, so scorching they blister your fingers. You exist in a perpetual cycle of fatigue. One plate finished, another starts. And why? Meanwhile, upstairs, someone grumbles their pheasant is somewhat dry. Picture roasting dozens of birds in a smoke-choked nightmare, and then learning that the queen frowned because her meat lacked moisture. That's palace reality. No glamour exists here, only sweat and pain. The atmosphere is dense, the racket constant, the hours infinite. You eat while standing, if you eat whatsoever. A bread crust, a stolen piece of cheese, maybe a spoonful of soup. Whatever you can grab when nobody's looking. Your hands reek of garlic, grease and ash. Your garments smell of smoke. And still you must lower your head when the steward appears, requesting another platter to be brought upstairs. The contradiction, naturally, is that the royals assumed this food appeared effortlessly, magically summoned. They gathered at tables covered with silver plates, drinking wine and chatting, never once thinking about the burned, blistered hands that had created their banquet. The fantasy of ease was built on your fatigue, and yet the kitchen wasn't purely suffering, it was also creativity. Cooks experimented endlessly, adopting French methods, incorporating German tastes, exploring Italian noodles. The Journal of William Daniel, a master cook of the 18th century, displays dishes as recognizable as macaroni and cheese and as strange as boiled turtle. You might be hovering over a pot one afternoon and understand you're helping to develop dishes that would spread worldwide. Not that you'll be credited for it, the ranking extended even here. The master cook commanded respect, the pastry chef possessed talent, but the scullery girl, invisible. She laboured in the filthiest section of the kitchen, scrubbing cookware until her hands split. Surrounded by water dark with grease, she was the bottom of the bottom. But without her, nothing operated. That's the vicious paradox of service. The least valued were frequently the most necessary. You wipe sweat from your face. Another pot overflows, another spit requires turning. The shift stretches forever, and still the plates keep arriving. You wonder how many dishes you've helped create in your existence. Hundreds. Thousands. And yet never once have you seated yourself at that upstairs table. Never once have you sampled the food you struggled over. This is the kitchen hell. No crystal, no silk, no recognition. Just smoke, blades, and endless labour. And when the diners depart and the plates return down, you'll still be here, scrubbing, scraping, sweating. The palace may shine above, but below it scorches. The palace kitchens are thundering, and you've been sweating over spits, stew cauldrons and pans all day long. But now arrives the true show, the banquet. Forget your family dinners of a roast and maybe a pudding. A Victorian banquet was entirely different, an exercise in ridiculous extravagance. 70 plates per course was not uncommon. Let me say that again, 70. Picture filling a table so heavily that the timber creaks, then repeating it all twice more before sweets. You transport the platters up individually, balancing silver plates so polished they practically blind you. Under candlelight, every movement is monitored, every gesture practiced. No noise, no stumble, no dripped sauce. Upstairs, the dining hall glows with crystal fixtures and mirrors, magnifying every twinkle of glass and every gleam of silver. Guests whisper politely, acting unimpressed, even as their eyes expand at the sheer volume of food. And what food? There are pies moulded like fortresses, puddings wobbling like towers, jellies that shimmer in the light, platters of jellied tongue, turtle soup, steaming thick and greasy. Even roasted puffins transported from the distant north. Yes, puffins, those adorable little birds with bright beaks. On the royal table, they weren't symbols, they were dinner. You position them precisely because presentation counts more than your back agony. The feast is served in the French manner, à la française, which means everything for one course appears on the table simultaneously, a stunning spread designed to overwhelm the senses. The first course might deliver enormous roasts, venison, pheasants, whole salmon shimmering with sauce. The second course eases things only marginally, perhaps delicately prepared vegetables, pies filled with game, custards and soufflés. And finally, dessert, the so-called sweet course, which could feature iced creams, candied fruits and elaborate cakes carved to amaze. Your function in all of this, to ensure it looks effortless, to move trays in and out like machinery, to refill glasses before they're drained, to predict every flutter of a royal eyebrow that might indicate hunger. Meanwhile, the diners pick carefully at their dishes, a fork there, a taste here. Nobody wants to seem gluttonous, and nobody could reasonably eat 70 plates in one meal, but that's not the objective. The objective is the performance of it, the show. The table is a platform, the food, the props, and the royals, the performers of the production. You're the stagehand, unseen, ensuring the curtain never drops. And after all this toil, what do you consume? Not the venison, not the pheasant, not the turtle soup. If you're fortunate, you might receive the scraps, what's scraped off platters once they come downstairs. Perhaps a sliver of meat, perhaps a crust of pie, perhaps the bones stripped clean by someone who hardly noticed the effort that created it. Congratulations! You've consumed royal remnants. The contradiction stings worse than the ovens. You've worked yourself destroyed, creating plates fit for kings. But your belly is filled with scraps and crusts, bread dried at the corners, a slice of cold pudding, the end of a loaf nobody upstairs desired. This is the nourishment of the unseen army. And yet even scraps have their conflicts. Higher-ranking workers like the steward, footman or housekeeper claimed the finest leftovers. They ate on decent meat, cheeses and pastries. The remainder filtered down the hierarchy until scullery girls and hallboys scraped bowls empty of broth. The very design of the banquet continued into the servant ranking. Even your remnants had a social order. Still, scraps beat starvation. They were energy for another shift of drudgery. And in some unusual cases they were minor treats, a sample of a dish you'd never otherwise experience. You might chew on a piece of roasted partridge and wonder briefly. So, this is how the wealthy exist. And then the bell sounds, and you're back to labour. Remember also that not all plates were ordinary. Exotic imports were treasured, pineapples, oranges, sugar and spices delivered from the remotest corners of empire. They weren't merely food, they were tokens of imperial strength. A pineapple positioned on the table was as much a declaration of control as a jewel in a crown. And you carrying it in understood it represented riches you'd never possess. By the conclusion of the banquet, you're stumbling. The trays feel weightier, the air hotter, the commotion louder. Upstairs, the royals recline in seats, sipping wine and moaning about their indigestion. Downstairs, you scrub grease from silver, mop puddles from floors and scrape bones into containers. The feast that mesmerized upstairs becomes waste below, and yet tomorrow it repeats all over again. Another banquet, another 70 plates, another evening of spectacle. The palace consumes, and you endure. The palace gleams, and you sweat. This is the performance of monarchy. Magnificence above, exhaustion below. And while they taste delicately on puffins and puddings, you chew on bread crusts in the darkness, hoping the scraps will be sufficient to keep you upright for another shift. You might assume all servants were identical. One large invisible crew united in misery. Wrong. Even below stairs, status controlled everything. The palace was not merely separated between royals and servants. It was separated again into tiers of servants, evaluating each other, scowling at each other, and frantically grasping to whatever fragment of superiority their role provided them. So let's begin at the summit. The butler. He was monarch of the downstairs realm, commander of wine cellars and silverware, lord of the dining hall. When he walked through the servants' quarters, everyone else stood straighter. He didn't scrub or transport. Oh no, he delivered orders. And yet, remember, he was still a servant. He might glare at you as though he controlled the palace, but truly, he was shining someone else's utensils. The butler glares at you, but he's still a servant himself. Just a servant with nicer buttons. Then came the housekeeper, imposing, observant, and dreaded. She managed the female workers, monitoring who polished the floors, who started the fires, and who dared leave marks on the railings. Her keys jangled like chains of authority, every ring on her belt a symbol of her dominance. And while she was technically beneath the royals, to you, she might as well have been royalty. Below them were the footmen, tall, handsome, selected for their looks as much as their ability. They wore elegant livery decorated with gold trim, stood beside coaches, opened doors and served at table with polish. Guests murmured about their stature and their bearing as though they were ornamental sculptures brought to life. And yet despite their elegance, they earned less than you might expect. They purchased their uniforms from their wages, and many finished their careers disabled from standing frozen for hours. Still, they looked down on kitchen girls as though being decorative were an accomplishment. Valets and ladies' maids held another peculiar tier. They were private servants, serving only one lord or lady, handling wardrobes, grooming and intimate tasks. Valets knew which buttons required polishing, which shoes required buffing, and which secrets required silence. Ladies' maids arranged hair, fastened corsets, and calmed moods. They lived near their employers, frequently sleeping just beyond their doors. This closeness gave them a curious power. They were common-born, but they held aristocratic reputations in their grasp. A careless word from a valet could destroy a gentleman's honour. A protest from a lady's maid could reveal a scandal that proximity was both advantage and cage. Then came the cooks. The head cook demanded respect, especially in the palace kitchens where dishes were displays of imperial pride. A talented cook could gain influence and sometimes even a reputation, recipes carrying their names, dishes transported across the empire. But beneath the head cook were legions of undercooks, pastry cooks and scullery labourers, each bound to their routine, peel potatoes, knead dough, scrub pans, repeat. The further you descended, the dirtier the tasks. And at the absolute bottom, grasping the final crumbs of status, were the scullery maids and hall boys. They scrubbed pots stained with grease, cleaned shoes muddied from the streets, emptied chamber pots and swept endless hallways. Nobody envied their positions. They were viewed as interchangeable, expendable children of poverty with minimal hope of ascending higher. If you were unlucky enough to be here, congratulations. You were at the bottom rung of the ladder, the shadow beneath shadows. But even this shadow had regulations. You had to understand your position. A scullery maid did not address a footman unless addressed first. A hallboy did not speak to the butler directly unless carrying a message. The hierarchy was invisible but rigid, maintained by stares, scoldings, and the occasional public embarrassment. The contradiction, naturally, is that none of it truly mattered to the royals upstairs. To them, you were all identical. But downstairs, these boundaries were everything. They decided who ate first when scraps were distributed, who sat where at the servants' table, and who received blame when something failed. Picture the absurdity. You all labour in misery, your backs aching in unison, but you still manage to look down on each other. The footman ridicules the scullery boy. The scullery boy despises the hall maid. The cook ignores the laundress, its human nature distorted into a hierarchy of suffering. And yet there was drive, even here. A hall boy could aspire to becoming a footman. A kitchen maid might advance to assistant cook. A shrewd lady's maid could marry well, or at least marry better than her mother. The palace was not merely a workplace, it was a ladder. Most never climbed it, but the chance dangled just enough promise to keep everyone obedient. So where does that position you? Somewhere near the base, most likely. Racing when bells chime, sweating in the kitchens, polishing shoes you'll never own. You look up the ladder and see only more work, only with nicer clothes and slightly improved food. But still you aspire. Because in a palace constructed on hierarchy, even the tiniest step upward feels like victory. This is the servant realm. A kingdom within a kingdom, governed not by crowns, but by aprons, uniforms, and who gets to sit nearest to the fire at night. It is not just, it is not gentle, and it is not glamorous, but it is authentic, and it determines your every conscious moment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you've left me standing at the bottom rung of YouTube's ladder, noticed, but never elevated. Be superior to a Victorian butler. Subscribe. You've survived the kitchens, you've survived the banquets. But now comes the aspect of palace life that nobody includes in the history texts. The bedrooms. The Victorian palace may sparkle from the exterior, but inside its private chambers, servants handled the kind of labour that demolished any fantasy of grandeur. You, for example, have a chamber pot that is full and heavy, and you're moving it down a long hallway, hoping that nothing inside of it splashes onto your shoes. Because yes, the Queen might wear beautiful jewellery, but she still required someone to take her waste away. That specific person is you. And you don't just clear out one of these items. Each bedroom, every room for guests, and every dressing room contains its own ceramic pot, always placed out of sight beneath a bed or a chair. When morning comes, you gather every single one, awkward, heavy, some cracked around the edge, and some containing unpleasant things from the night before. You carry them using both hands, your shoulders rounded, trying hard not to take a deep breath. The bad odour follows you constantly, foul and impossible to escape. There isn't a polite or gentle way to describe what it is. It is human refuse, and it is your sworn duty. Congratulations on your position. You are essentially the equivalent of Victorian-era indoor plumbing. Now let's turn our attention to the preparation of bath water. In a time when there were no running water taps, every single bath had to be physically prepared by hand. This meant you had to constantly carry large buckets of water up from the scullery, then heat it inside huge copper pots over a blazing fire, and then haul the buckets upstairs, flight after flight, bucket after bucket, step after step, until the bathtub was finally filled up. Your arms ache, your knees are weak, and your back protests in pain. And right after you finish filling it, right when the water is finally at the right temperature, the person steps in, spends maybe 5 minutes soaking, and then immediately demands that all of the water be emptied out again. You lug bath water up countless flights of stairs only to immediately throw it away 5 minutes later. That's the core of the work. The tubs themselves were not what we would consider luxurious by today's standards. They might be a simple tin tub, or perhaps a ceramic one for the very wealthy, often brought into a bedroom and shielded by a screen to provide privacy. The soap was harsh, often created from animal fats, and it would leave your hands cracked and red. Hot water lost its heat quickly, so you were always needing to haul in fresh buckets to keep the water warm enough. And if the person bathing happened to be a royal, the temperature had to be precisely correct. Not too cold, and definitely not too hot. May you be spared if they test it with a toe and look unhappy. And naturally, once the bath was finished, you had the job of carrying all of that used water away. Bucket after bucket was poured down simple drains, splashed into gutters, or simply dumped out in the yard. The strenuous cycle was unending. Water comes up, water goes down. You are the living pipeline for the whole palace. Chamber pots and baths were not just daily tasks. They were ritualistic acts that reinforced the social hierarchy. To carry away another person's waste was a daily visceral reminder of your low position. To draw a bath for someone else meant sacrificing your own ability to rest for their well-being. You were not simply scrubbing floors, you were erasing their discomfort. It is important to remember that some of the household staff who were the most trusted were also assigned the most humiliating tasks. The gentleman's valet, who helped him shave, the maid who managed her lady's corsets and hairpins, the necessary women who cleared the pots. All of these individuals were close to their royal employers in ways that felt personal, sometimes awkward, and always discreet. These were roles that demanded close physical proximity, and with that closeness came a strange blend of being both relied upon and slightly disdained. For you, however, it is simply pure exhaustion. You haul the water, you scrub the tubs, you carry the refuse, you wipe up any spills from the polished pots before carefully returning them to where they belong. You replace the used towels, you beat the dust out of the mattresses, you shake out all the bedclothes and gently remove every single wrinkle from the bedding. The bedrooms must always look spotless, as if no one had actually just slept, sweated or snored within them. And yet, you know the absolute truth. You have been the one to carry the waste, you have scrubbed the sheets stained with sweat, you have hauled the water that cooled off too quickly. Hidden behind every beautiful bedroom is the unpleasant reality of relentless physical labour. It is a strange thing to consider, isn't it? That the royals could command vast armies, dramatically shape entire empires, and force nations to submit to their wishes, but they still fundamentally needed you to clear away the things they left behind. At night, their power has clear limits, and somewhere inside this palace, a maid with a slop bucket proves this fact every single morning. So here you find yourself, hunched over beneath the weight of heavy water, wrinkling your nose at the chamber pots, your back aching from bending over all the beds. Nobody gives you praise, nobody bothers to thank you. But without your work, the entire palace would smell, and the royal family would be forced to wallow in their own filth. This is the reality of your life in the sleeping quarters of a Victorian palace. Not fancy velvet pillows and linen sheets with embroidery, but sweat, coarse soap and slop buckets. And when tomorrow morning arrives, you will have to repeat the entire routine again. Shh. The palace may be a hub of activity on the lower floors, but up here, in the nursery sections, everything is hushed and still. Or at least, it is supposed to be quiet. This is the area where the royal children are raised and where staff members take on responsibilities that could potentially alter the entire course of human history. Forget any image you have of queens gently rocking their infants to sleep. That particular task is now yours, or it belongs to someone with your specific job. Inside the Victorian palace, the job of childcare was almost always delegated entirely to others. Wet nurses, governesses and nannies populated the nursery wings, ensuring that the royal babies survived long enough to grow up and inherit their empires. Let's begin with the wet nurse. If you were selected for this delicate role, congratulations are in order. You have just been contracted to be both vitally essential and completely forgotten. Your physical body is no longer considered your own. It has been dedicated to the service of the crown. You provide nourishment to the royal infant with your own milk, often having had to leave your own baby behind in some distant village. You are meticulously scrutinized for your overall health, your moral character, and your standards of cleanliness. The slightest sign of illness, the smallest hint of unacceptable behaviour, and you will be immediately dismissed. And here is the overwhelming pressure you face. The entire future of the monarchy literally depends on your ability to simply burp a baby. No pressure whatsoever. Now, try to picture it from your perspective. You are gently holding a baby, wrapped in a swaddling blanket in your arms, the fine silk of its wrapping touching your rough work apron. The cries of the baby echo loudly through the expansive corridors, sharp enough to summon every nurse in the whole building. You sway very softly, singing a quiet lullaby that you know will never be credited to you. The child you hold will one day grow up to be a king or a queen, or maybe just a historical footnote. But you will vanish from memory without a single trace. The nursery itself feels both reassuringly cosy and slightly oppressive. Small fires are kept low in the grates to make sure the rooms stay warm, and the air carries a light scent of warm milk and dried lavender. Toys, including wooden blocks, various dolls, and rattles, are spread across the floor. But you know you dare not leave them disorganized for long. Every single detail of the royal child's surroundings is meticulously managed, routinely checked by the governesses, judged harshly by any visitors, and carefully noted in various personal diaries. The nursery is far more than just a place where children are raised. It is a very public stage where the perceived moral character and the ongoing health of the entire royal dynasty are constantly put on display. Then there is the role of the governess. She is a figure of unyielding authority, a severe and strict guardian who oversees the lessons in manners, religious instruction and academic learning. Imagine being a royal child, with your entire day scheduled minute by minute, your every movement watched closely, your behaviour corrected with a sharp word or a disapproving look. And who is the person delivering all of this required discipline? Not your actual mother, nor your father, but the governess, the hired help who is shaping the future monarch. And one must not forget the dedicated nanny. She is the constant, quiet companion of the nursery. She fastens the ribbons, combs the hair, cleans the scraped knees, and kisses the small bruises. She is a source of warm comfort, where the governess is all severity, a steady presence where the queen is often entirely absent. The royal children very frequently develop much closer personal bonds with their nannies than they do with their own parents, simply because it is the nannies who gently tuck them into bed at the close of the day and wake them when the morning begins. The crown may legally belong to their parents, but the detailed everyday care completely belongs to you. And you are never permitted to forget the immense consequences of your work. A child who is sickly or unwell reflects extremely poorly on the entire staff. A sudden, embarrassing tantrum during dinner is seen as a clear failure in discipline on someone's part. Every tiny cough, every minor rash, every single sleepless night immediately becomes a critical matter of duty. If the child flourishes and does well, the parents are pleased. If the child struggles, the resulting blame will land directly and squarely on your weary shoulders. The sheer absurdity of the whole situation is incredible. On the grand floor above, the royals present themselves to the public as perfect models of devoted family life. They showcase their children as powerful symbols of dynastic continuity and strength. But the stark reality is that those children spend much more time being held in your arms than in the arms of their parents. You are the person who is feeding them, bathing them, teaching them their first steps. You are the unseen presence operating behind the formal throne, the steady hands that lovingly raise the future crown before it is ever actually placed upon a royal head. Of course, this position does come with certain advantages. Wet nurses and nannies were frequently paid better wages than the simple scullery maids or the hall boys. Some were granted comfortable rooms within the palace, allowances to purchase new clothing, and even promised future pensions after long periods of loyal service. But the personal cost was exceptionally high. You gave up your own children's presents to dedicate your life to raising someone else's. You completely surrendered your personal time, your body, and your identity, all for the benefit of a dynasty that would ultimately never speak or recall your name. And yet the emotional connections you formed could be deeply real. Many royal children genuinely adored their nannies, continued to write letters to them as they became adults, and remembered them fondly long after the pressures of court life swept them away. For some servants, that deep, personal connection was more than enough reward. A personal legacy that was not formally recorded in history books, but lived on in the quiet, profound affection of a child who once held tightly to your guiding hand. But for you, as you stand alone in the dimly lit nursery tonight, there is no time for such sentimentality. The small fire is slowly dying, the baby is finally sleeping peacefully, and you quietly tiptoe away on your tired, aching feet. Tomorrow you will perform all of this work again. You will feed, you will rock, you will soothe, you will teach. It is invisible labour. It has truly monumental consequences. This is the secluded nursery world of the Victorian palace. It is a world of quiet halls, exhausting, sleepless nights, and the entire future of the monarchy dependent on whether or not you can successfully keep an infant from crying. And when the eventual history books write about this famous prince or that renowned princess, remember that it was your tireless efforts that carried them safely through their vulnerable first few years. Without you, the entire dynasty would have ended. It would have been snuffed out in its own cradle. The palace may appear to the outside world as an impenetrable fortress of solemn marble and strict ceremony, but you know the whole truth is different. You constantly live and work in its secret, hidden passages. And those passages are constantly filled not just with the sound of footsteps, but with the quiet murmur of whispers. Being a dedicated servant in a vast Victorian palace meant you were privy to far more secrets than you ever wanted to know, secrets you absolutely never asked to hear. You possess knowledge that, if revealed, would completely destroy reputations, but say even one word of it, and you will be instantly cast out. Servants literally stood closer to the royal family than any other people did. You were the ones who dressed them, bathed them, served their most private meals, and carried away all of their personal waste. You were constantly moving through their private bedrooms, their secluded drawing rooms, and even their closed carriages. You observed things that formal visitors were absolutely never meant to see. Secret love affairs, hidden illnesses, sudden flares of temper, private moments of tears, all of the human failings that the monarchy desperately insisted it did not possess. You witnessed them every single day. Try to imagine walking silently into a private room with a fresh set of linens, only to unexpectedly discover a prince already in bed with a person who is very much not his actual wife. You immediately drop your gaze, pretend that you completely fail to notice the sight, and calmly continue folding the sheets as if the scene directly in front of you were completely invisible. Or picture yourself delivering a tray of afternoon tea to a duchess whose face is bright red and blotchy from a furious argument. She immediately snaps harsh words at you, not because you have done anything wrong, but simply because you are conveniently there, an easy and safe target for her intense pent-up anger. You simply bow your head, withdraw from the room, and later whisper the entire story only within the secure servants' hall, where it quietly becomes one more undeniable piece in the wall of private secrets held below the main stairs. Some of these closely guarded secrets were genuinely dangerous. Members of the royal family would catch serious illnesses that were absolutely never supposed to be spoken of publicly. Venereal diseases, nervous breakdowns, severe fevers, all quickly hushed up for fear of sparking a widespread scandal. And yet someone still had to quickly fetch a doctor during the middle of the night. Someone was required to clean the soiled bedsheets. Someone had to quietly endure the crushing silence that followed the event. That unfortunate someone was you. You might actually be surprised by just how much quiet power that proximity gave you. In a tightly controlled palace environment, knowledge was a valuable form of currency. A valet who was fully aware of his master's mounting gambling debts could potentially leverage that critical information to secure a better future position. A lady's maid who chose to keep silent about her mistress's private indiscretions might be quietly rewarded with high-quality cast-off dresses or possibly even granted a small pension. Remaining silent was highly valuable. Widespread gossip, however, could be absolutely fatal to one's career. And here is the profound irony of the entire situation. You personally held possession of more private secrets than the public newspapers ever dared to print. Imagine fully knowing every single scandal that was unfolding inside the palace, but still earning a wage that was lower than a modern fast food worker's. That is the bitter reality of palace service for you. Your mind is filled to the brim with compelling stories that would be perfect for novels, yet your pocket contains only meagre wages, barely enough to purchase the bread you need. The internal pressure to maintain the illusion was absolutely constant. You had to completely perfect the subtle art of not reacting. You had to pretend not to hear things, pretend not to see things, pretend that you did not know what was happening. If a royal guest was drunkenly staggering through the long hallways, you immediately looked the other way. If a fierce quarrel suddenly erupted behind closed doors, you simply smoothed the carpets and ignored the sound of breaking glass. If someone dared to whisper about treason, you quietly hummed a soft tune and diligently dusted the mantelpiece. Discretion was not simply a desirable quality, it was an absolute necessity for survival. This strict code did not mean that secrets never occasionally leaked out. Servants did sometimes sell their personal stories to eager newspapers, often concealing their identities under false names. A recently disgruntled footman, a maid who had been unfairly dismissed, a valet who had grown tired of endless bowing, all of them could trade their valuable whispers for coin. Scandals would sometimes burst into public view, but most often they remained securely locked inside the massive palace walls, buried deep beneath your collective, unwavering silence. Consider the deep contradictions inherent in the system. The entire palace presented itself to the world as a shining model of moral virtue, a perfect, gleaming example of wholesome family life. And yet you, quietly polishing candlesticks in the dark corner, knew the unvarnished truth. Hidden behind the immaculate public image were secret love affairs, untreated illnesses, petty rivalries, and an abundance of small-mindedness. You did not live inside a storybook fantasy. You lived inside a constantly unfolding soap opera that absolutely no one outside the walls was ever supposed to watch. And the full weight of that secret sat heavily on your shoulders every single time you bowed your head, every time you curtsied low. You carried knowledge that you were legally and professionally forbidden to speak aloud. You might spend years of your life observing the sudden rise and fall of various tempers, the slow decline of someone's health, moments of betrayal and quiet reconciliations, all while your own personal name was never once written down anywhere. You were simultaneously invisible and absolutely indispensable, the quiet, silent archivist of the monarchy's most intimate private life, and so you came to understand the profound central paradox of immense palace power. Despite having absolutely no formal power yourself, you knew every single thing and you were utterly forbidden to ever speak of it. You stood inside the rooms where history was quietly unfolding in hushed whispers, and then you returned to the servants' hall to simply eat small crusts of stale bread. The entire palace was a massive, elaborately decorated stage, and you were both the stagehand setting the scenes and the audience watching the whole performance, viewing it all unfold without ever being allowed to step into the actual spotlight. This was the true core burden of palace service. It was not merely the deeply aching back, the truly endless daily chores, or the short, restless nights. It was the utter silence required of you, the vast knowledge locked tightly behind your lips, the difficult truths that you would carry with you to your grave, always unspoken, never publicly acknowledged, and ultimately forgotten by history. So when the world above admired the formal palace as an absolute fortress of dignity, you would simply smile a quiet, knowing smile. You knew that the whole structure was built upon layers of secrets, and you were the one holding the actual keys to all of them. You have been working non-stop since before the sun came up. You have carried heavy coal, painstakingly lit numerous fires, polished countless boots, aggressively scrubbed floors, hauled tons of water, and served numerous meals that you were never allowed to eat. By this point, you might reasonably be asking yourself a question. Surely even a servant inside a vast Victorian palace was granted a moment to rest, a few rare, precious hours to truly call their own. Well, the answer is, sort of. But do not allow yourself to get your hopes up too high. Personal free time for palace servants was an extremely fluid and slippery concept. It existed only in the tiny gaps that appeared between moments of intense labour, gaps that were so infinitesimally small they barely qualified as actual time off at all. If you happened to be truly exceptionally lucky, you might manage to snatch a few short minutes after all of the royal family had finally gone to bed, when the relentless servant bells had at long last fallen silent. But even then, your exhausted body ached far too much for you to actually enjoy the moment. Try to imagine yourself quietly creeping into the servants' communal hall, simply collapsing onto a hard wooden bench and finally stretching your legs for the very first time all day long. The low fire in the grate is nearly out, the small room smells strongly of damp wool and coal dust, and your fellow servants are sitting hunched over, half asleep, their hands still red and raw from endless scrubbing. You speak in hushed, quiet tones, if you speak at all, because even the softest voices carry, and the very last thing anyone needs is yet another unexpected order. What could you possibly accomplish in those very few moments? Not very much, truthfully. Perhaps a small bit of mending work. Servants were strictly expected to repair their own uniforms and clothing, so your so-called leisure time might actually be spent painstakingly darning a sock or carefully patching a hole in your apron. It sounds absolutely romantic, doesn't it? If you wished to read something, your choices were severely limited. The Holy Bible was perfectly acceptable. A simple prayer book was tolerated. But serious novels? Forget about it completely. Too much reading, it was believed, fostered dangerous discontent and unnecessary imagination. A young maid who was caught reading Jane Austen or Charles Dickens risked being severely scolded or, even worse, being instantly dismissed from her post. After all, if the servants were allowed to fill their heads with exciting stories of love and grand adventure, they might eventually start to believe that they deserved those very things for themselves, and we certainly could not allow that to happen, could we? So, you secretly steal 5 minutes to yourself with a candle, painstakingly tracing the delicate words on a page by the faint flicker of the flame, your eyes straining hard against the creeping darkness. For just this single, brief moment, you manage to forget the unpleasant chamber pots and the constant coal dust. You get to live in a completely different world entirely. And then, of course, the ever-present bell suddenly rings. Naturally, it rings. Personal leisure time was not only extremely scarce, it was also constantly and rigidly policed. Servants were explicitly not supposed to linger in one spot. They were not supposed to excessively gossip with one another, and they were strictly forbidden from wasting a single minute of time. Idle hands are the devil's preferred workshop, they sternly cautioned, as if hauling heavy buckets and vigorously scrubbing linens all day long would somehow leave any real opportunity for idleness. Still, that demanding expectation hung over you like a persistent shadow. Every single moment that was not actively spent working had to appear immediately useful and productive. If you were caught sitting down for too long, someone would quickly appear and find you a new task to complete. And even when you were granted a very rare free afternoon off, it was never truly free. You might be permitted to take a short, supervised walk outside the formal palace grounds, but only under the strictest, most restrictive conditions. You were not to wander too far away, you were strictly forbidden from loitering in any public taverns, and you absolutely could not mingle with any suspicious characters. You were meant to carry your required invisibility with you, even when you briefly ventured into the world outside the imposing palace walls. Occasionally there were brief, unexpected moments of joy. A sudden, shared laugh whispered quickly in the servants' hall, a quick, quiet game of cards played in near silence. A familiar song softly hummed while polishing the brass if you were reasonably sure no one was listening closely. On very rare feast days or grand royal celebrations, the staff might be allowed a bit more personal time, perhaps even a very small party organised for themselves. But these few treasured moments were clear exceptions to the rule, not the standard practice. They shone brilliantly like distant stars in an otherwise completely endless night of back-breaking labour. Consider the incredibly cruel paradox inherent in your life. You lived inside a massive palace that was absolutely bursting with unimaginable luxury, gilded ballrooms, sprawling gardens, huge libraries, and yet absolutely none of it was yours to actually enjoy. You were never invited to dance beneath the glittering chandeliers. You were never allowed to stroll leisurely through the perfectly manicured gardens. You never got to leaf through the expensive, leather-bound volumes inside the royal library. You were the person who scrubbed those magnificent places clean, only to then leave them behind for the rich, privileged people to fully enjoy. Your personal free time was always relegated to the dark, cramped, dim corners, and it was always heartbreakingly fleeting. And here is the deeply unpleasant truth of the matter. The palace did not actually want you to be fully rested, it simply wanted you to be instantly available. The less you thought of yourself as a complete human being with complex personal needs, the more fundamentally useful you became to the institution. The concept of personal free time was a genuinely dangerous idea because it served to remind you that you actually possessed a self, that a life existed beyond your constant work. It was simply better for the system to keep you perpetually tired, constantly busy and easily obedient. It was better to constantly remind you that even a small amount of leisure was merely borrowed time, never truly fully yours to keep. So what did you ultimately do with that precious time? You simply slept. You utterly collapsed into a narrow, hard cot inside a cold attic room, pulled a thin, coarse blanket over your deeply aching body, and drifted immediately into short, restless dreams. And then, before you even fully knew what had happened, 5 o'clock in the morning arrived again. The loud bell rang sharply, and all of your personal free time immediately dissolved into thin smoke. This was the inescapable reality of life for a servant inside a Victorian palace. It was work without any clear end, and leisure without any true meaning or rest. It was a whole lifetime spent giving, with hardly a single minute ever kept strictly for yourself. And yet, despite all of its inherent cruelty, you stubbornly endured it all, because what other real options were there for the poor, the orphaned, or the absolutely desperate in that era? The palace offered regular food, a steady wage, and reliable shelter, but the terrible cost was the complete surrender of your personal freedom. So no, free time did not truly exist for you, not in any meaningful way that actually mattered. It was carefully rationed out in tiny crumbs, snatched away like forbidden contraband, and instantly stolen back by the very next harsh clang of the bell. You might allow yourself to think that tomorrow will somehow be fundamentally different, that you will miraculously manage to find a full hour, or perhaps even 2, entirely for yourself. But do not foolishly deceive yourself. Tomorrow The palace will still urgently require its numerous fires to be lit, its floors to be aggressively scrubbed clean, its vast tables to be formally laid out, and you will still be standing right there, your candle already snuffed out, your apron tightly tied, absolutely ready to run at the sound of the very next command. You have now spent the entire day tirelessly running up and down countless staircases, hauling heavy loads of coal, scrubbing vast amounts of linen, serving elaborate banquets, and instantly disappearing whenever the persistent bells demanded it. Finally, at long last, the immense palace has mercifully fallen quiet. The royal family is now snugly tucked into their soft feather beds, peacefully dreaming underneath velvet canopies. And you slowly climb one final miserable staircase, this time not to serve someone else, but only to utterly collapse yourself. Welcome at last to the servants' quarters. Do not allow yourself to picture any form of comfort here. These tiny rooms were never initially designed for peaceful rest. They were coldly designed solely for efficient containment. They are cramped, perpetually cold, and absolutely bare, intentionally tucked away high up in the lonely attics or buried deep down in the dank basements, far away from the beautifully gilded chambers that sit directly above. You forcefully push open the heavy door to your shared dormitory, and a strong, specific smell immediately greets you before anything else does. It is dampness, always a persistent, inescapable dampness. The plaster walls openly weep in the cold winter months. The stagnant air hangs heavy and thick during the oppressive summer heat. The straw inside your mattress is stale and musty, permanently flattened down from the weight of countless bodies who slept there before you. Large rats brazenly scurry in and out of the corners, completely unafraid of your presence. The faint, persistent scratching sound keeps you company throughout the entire night. If you narrow your eyes tightly, you might almost imagine it is a luxury inn. That is, if a luxury inn demanded your entire sense of personal dignity as the only method of payment. The room is always shared, of course, as personal privacy is a luxury reserved only for the rich. You sleep packed in tightly, side by side with numerous other servants, squeezed into long rows of simple iron-framed beds or thin straw pallets. The chorus of constant snores, hacking coughs, and the continuous shifting of bodies. This is the sad, restless lullaby of a life spent in palace service. If one person briefly tosses and turns, the whole cramped room instantly stirs. If one person wakes up even a little too early, you are all immediately awakened too. And if one foolish person dares to light a small candle after the designated hours to secretly sneak in a little bit of reading, well, good luck trying to successfully hide that defiant act from the ever-watchful housekeeper. There are absolutely no velvet curtains hanging here, no soft carpets placed underfoot. The thin floorboards constantly creak under the slightest pressure, the old plaster is visibly cracking, and cold drafts slice relentlessly through the windows, as if the thin glass panes weren't even physically there to block them. In the dead of winter, you must tightly huddle together underneath thin, scratchy blankets, your own breath visibly misting in the frigid air. In the height of summer, the oppressive heat rises unbearably from the massive kitchens directly below until you feel as though you are attempting to sleep inside a chimney flue. All of your meagre personal possessions must fit neatly into a single small box placed at the foot of your bed, if you are lucky enough to have even that much space. Perhaps a simple comb, one extra pair of worn stockings, maybe a worn familiar prayer book. Some servants manage to carefully keep small treasured keepsakes. A personal letter sent from home, a tiny scrap of coloured ribbon, a small locket with no chain attached. These few small tokens of a past personal selfhood must be hidden far away because the formal palace system did not want you to possess any identity beyond that of dutiful service. The necessary washrooms are sparse and always shared by many. Water must be physically carried great distances to them. Wash basins are quickly passed along from one servant to the next. The available towels are coarse and rough, so even simple personal hygiene is a difficult duty, not a comforting ritual. And yet, when you compare your circumstances to the most destitute labourers working in the city slums, your quarters feel almost luxurious in comparison. Almost. At least you possess a reliable roof over your head. At least the rats are somewhat predictable in their movements. The strict social order extends its long reach even into this hidden space. Senior staff members might be fortunate enough to have small private rooms with a proper bed and perhaps a simple writing desk. The important butler or the formidable housekeeper might even have the luxury of a warm fireplace. Their quarters are a completely different world, set far apart from yours. But for everyone else, you quickly learn the harsh lesson of how to live pressed shoulder to shoulder, cheek by jowl, in an endless cycle of painful compromise between pure exhaustion and sheer endurance. Think once more of the glaring absurdity of the situation. You physically reside inside a luxurious palace surrounded by endless amounts of polished gold and expensive marble, and yet your own personal bed is barely any better than a poor pauper's cot. Upstairs, the Queen is softly reclining on expensive silken pillows. Downstairs, you are frantically stuffing old rags into the cracks around your window frame to stop the relentless wind from howling in. And yet, in a strange, unexpected way, these severely cramped quarters manage to hold their own unique kind of community. Quiet laughter is whispered softly underneath blankets. Small private secrets are cautiously shared in the darkness, and personal stories are quickly told when complete exhaustion gives way to stubborn shared companionship. You may have been completely invisible to the powerful people upstairs, but here, in this tight space, at least you're truly seen by your peers. Still, this is fundamentally not a life that anyone would ever envy. The constant noise, the persistent smell, the unbearable cold, the complete lack of any personal space. It wears you down, mentally and physically, just as surely as the demanding work does. Your body aches deeply from the long day. Your mind desperately craves pure, total quiet. But peaceful rest never seems to come easily here. Your sleep is always shallow, constantly interrupted by loud bells, sharp footsteps, or the familiar gnawing hunger in your stomach. And so you sleep only in the small cracks of time that appear between your duties, tightly curled up on a rough straw mattress that painfully pricks your skin, while rats rustle constantly in the hidden corners and the unforgiving wind whistles sharply through the broken window glass. The vast palace glitters brilliantly above you, but you must live out your whole existence in its deep shadows, pressed tightly into small corners, always anxiously waiting for the morning to finally arrive and drag you back into the harsh, demanding cycle once again. This is the bleak, core truth of the servants' quarters. It is not a grand place, it is not a noble place, and it is certainly not a dignified place. It is merely cramped, perpetually cold, and absolutely necessary for the system to function. You're only there to temporarily rest, not to actually live your life. Your entire life completely belongs to the palace, even during the few hours you spend in sleep. So close your tired eyes now. Try to pretend that the oppressive dampness is simply a refreshing cool breeze. Try to pretend that the familiar scratching sound is merely the gentle creak of old timbers. Try to pretend that this rough straw is a soft feather bed and that this thin worn blanket is luxurious velvet. Pretend, just for a single brief moment, that this is actual comfort. Because tomorrow morning, precisely at 5 o'clock, the harsh bells will ring loudly again, and your imaginary luxury inn will instantly vanish, just like the faint dream it never truly was. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, you are currently treating this content exactly the same way the palace brutally treated its own servants, using their hard work and then instantly forgetting about them in the dark. Do not repeat that same history. Please subscribe right now. Not every single part of palace service was a perpetual cycle of endless drudgery. Some servants held onto a small, faint glimmer of desperate hope that a whole lifetime spent scrubbing, hauling, and endlessly bowing might eventually lead to a better, more secure life. Social mobility inside a Victorian palace was exceedingly rare, but it did, occasionally, exist. It did not happen often, and it was certainly not easy, but it happened just enough times to keep the majority of the working staff dreaming. Consider the remarkable true story of William Fortnum, for instance. Once upon a time, he was just one more anonymous palace servant charged with the deeply unglamorous daily job of carefully cleaning out the half-burned wax stubs from all the used candles. At St. James's Palace, the royal family insisted on having their candles always look completely fresh, and William quickly realised that he could safely pocket all of the half-burned ends and secretly sell them for a small profit on the side streets. It was not a large amount of money, but it was a crucial start. That tiny private side hustle eventually grew into a thriving shop and, ultimately, into Fortnum and Mason, which is now one of the most famously expensive luxury grocers in all of London, going from clearing out old chamber candles to supplying lavish hampers for the entire aristocracy. Now that is what you call exceptional upward mobility, but you should not allow your own hopes to rise too high. William Fortnum was a distinct exception to the rule, not the standard reality. For the vast majority of the staff, palace service was not a useful ladder to climb, but rather a brutal, monotonous treadmill. Your great-grandfather emptied the dirty bedpans, your own father emptied the bedpans. And now, congratulations, you have officially inherited the long family dynasty of the chamber pot. Intergenerational family service was not only extremely common, it was actively expected by the system. Entire family generations gave up their whole lives to the service of the palace, their common surnames echoing faintly in dusty old staff records, while their unique personal individuality slowly disappeared and died away. Imagine the harsh reality of being born directly into this rigid system. Your father held the position of a footman. Your mother was a laundress. From the moment you were physically able to walk, you were immediately trained only for a life of service. You meticulously learned how to polish silverware, how to correctly curtsy, how to stand perfectly still with your hands formally folded. There was absolutely no possibility of you ever becoming a lawyer, a physician, or even a simple shopkeeper in the outside world. Your entire future destiny was already inextricably tied to the narrow palace corridors. Service was not a mere professional career choice. It was an unshakable family tradition passed down through the bloodline. This entire dynasty of unending servitude stretched back for many decades. Some of the families proudly boasted to outsiders of their long palace connections. My grandfather was the one who personally carried the soup bowl to the king, they would boast. To people outside the system, it sounded incredibly prestigious and impressive. But you, standing here right now with painfully sore feet and an empty, rumbling stomach, knew the whole sad truth. Your entire family tree was nothing more than just another extension of the constantly ringing bellboard. Still, the small flame of personal ambition did sometimes manage to flicker to life. There were very rare opportunities to gradually rise through the official ranks. A hallboy might one day be promoted to a footman. A clever, hard-working scullery maid might eventually be made an assistant cook. A discreet and loyal valet could potentially win favour and be given the opportunity to travel abroad with his master. These were undeniably very small promotions, but in a structured world where every single rung of the social ladder was steep and difficult, they were deeply important. Each tiny step up meant slightly better pay, slightly higher quality food, and perhaps even a slightly warmer, more comfortable bed to sleep in. And being in close proximity to great power could sometimes open very strange, unexpected doors. Ladies' maids were occasionally given beautiful, expensive, cast-off dresses from their mistresses, silks and delicate lace that they could never possibly afford to buy on their own meagre wages. Some of the valets privately inherited small personal trinkets when their masters finally passed away, and a very few lucky servants managed to marry quite well, catching the attention of wealthy clerks, prosperous tradesmen, or even minor gentry who were regular visitors to the palace. Service did not necessarily guarantee a lifetime of poverty forever, but for the vast majority, it did not guarantee a permanent escape either. There is a deep, fundamental, cruel irony in this entire situation. The palace constantly advertised itself to the world as a place of genuine opportunity, a place where absolute loyalty would always be rewarded handsomely. And yes, intense loyalty might possibly earn you a small medal, a meagre pension, or a dismissive pat on the head from someone far too wealthy to even remember your actual name later on. But for every single William Fortnum who managed to build a successful empire, there were literally thousands of others who quietly worked themselves directly into an early grave with absolutely nothing more than permanently calloused hands to show for their efforts. And these long dynasties of servitude did not simply choose to serve the palace, they were utterly bound to it by necessity. Once your whole family was firmly established inside the system, it became incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, to ever get out completely. Sons dutifully replaced their fathers and daughters immediately replaced their mothers. Service was undeniably steady employment in an uncertain world. It was much safer than the brutal factory work and significantly more reliable than uncertain farm labour. So, entire families willingly remained for generations after generation, trading their true personal freedom for a small amount of stability, sacrificing their individuality for a small secure place inside the enormous palace machine. What did all of this harsh reality actually mean for you personally? It meant waking up every single day, knowing that your future path was already completely carved out for you. You were not truly free to dream of successfully opening your own shop, or of writing a published book, or of bravely sailing across the vast oceans. You were predestined to tirelessly scrub the exact same floors that your father had scrubbed, to instantly answer the exact same loud bells that your mother had answered, and to ultimately collapse onto the very same rough straw mattress where your tired grandparents had once anxiously slept. And yet people steadfastly endured this because the system of service offered something that the harsh outside world rarely ever provided. That one thing was security. In an era when city slums festered with fatal diseases, when dangerous factories relentlessly chewed up young workers and spat them out permanently crippled, the palace at least reliably provided daily meals, basic uniforms, and a small amount of shelter. It was undeniably grim shelter, yes, but it was shelter nonetheless. For many poor families, this harsh bargain was infinitely better than being completely free. It was better to inherit a dirty chamber pot duty than to slowly starve to death in a dark, cold gutter. Still, imagine the immense emotional weight of it all. Knowing that your family's last name in the official palace registers meant that you were permanently bound to the absolute lowest rungs of recorded history. For the monarch to enjoy greater comfort, more luxurious meals and a finer wardrobe, the lives of your family members were spent in service and concluded in obscurity. Your lineage was not defined by the sparkle of gold, but by starched fabric and back-breaking labour. And the cruel reality is this. History only remembers the exceptions, the ones like the Fortnums who managed to rise above. It ignores the countless anonymous families who toiled for centuries, their very identities absorbed by the palace stone. Your kin may have spent 4 generations carrying meals, but the historical account will hardly acknowledge it. Your name, at best, is a quick note on a dusty staff register, sandwiched between the designations for kitchen help and shoe cleaners. True, social mobility existed, but it was a rare, fragile, and inconsistent occurrence. Most often you inherited the cleaning rag, the mop, and the coal scuttle. Your birthright was duty, your enduring legacy, a lack of recognition. Standing here, balancing another waste vessel, the truth settles over you. Your family's ultimate contribution to the crown was not in royal titles or peace treaties. It was in gleaming floors, immaculate linens, and timely supper service. This was your heritage. This was the extent of your dynasty. Your great-grandfather scrubbed chamber pots. Your father scrubbed chamber pots. And now you find yourself doing the very same. Welcome to the inherited occupation. Not every member of the Victorian palace staff was born within view of its grand towers. Some were brought from distant lands, imported like decorative objects, showcased like imperial tokens, only to be immediately put to the same endless chore of labour as everyone else. You arrive at the royal household with a strong accent, your skin unused to the damp London climate. Your personal clothing is exchanged for official livery the instant you cross the threshold. Your voice, your face, both viewed as exotic and simultaneously treated with suspicion. To the royal family, you are a curious novelty. To the rest of the staff, you represent competition. To yourself, you are trapped. The palace enjoyed putting its variety on display. When it served to heighten the spectacle, black trumpeters in intricate costumes were placed strategically in royal parades, their presence a colourful show designed to impress foreign visitors. Attendants from India, brought through the mechanisms of empire, sometimes functioned as pages or footmen, their headdresses and fine silks deliberately arranged to underscore the vast reach of British power. Servants from Turkish or Middle Eastern backgrounds were sometimes hired for roles of remote attendants, not because the royals desperately needed extra staff, but because their presence silently declared, "Behold the extent of our domain." Congratulations, you are a symbol of cosmopolitanism. Too bad you are still stuck polishing the floors. To the royal family, you were merely living ornamentation. Your being there made the residence appear global, sophisticated, and powerful. At a formal dinner or a procession, you were as much a spectacle as the silver cutlery. Guests might exchange low remarks about your distinctive speech, your foreign looks, or your bright uniform, as though you were part of the afternoon's amusement. But the illusion of glamour evaporated the moment the event concluded. Once the horns fell silent and the dignitaries departed, you were back in the shared servants' hall, sitting shoulder to shoulder, eating leftover scraps and hauling heavy water buckets. The local staff might eye you with wariness, gossiping about preferential treatment if the royals favoured you, or making fun of your way of speaking if they did not. You were suspended in an uncertain space, neither genuinely promoted nor fully accepted. The true irony, naturally, is that your actual tasks were nearly identical. Whether you were a laundry worker from Kent or a musician from Africa, you still had to answer service bells, shine shoes, carry trays, or dispose of waste. The palace liked to point at you as proof of its magnificent status, but it consistently ensured you remembered your place as a subordinate. And there was always a feeling of distrust, an omnipresent doubt, in an era where anything foreign was automatically suspect. You were deemed trustworthy enough to help dress the royal personage, but not trusted enough to move around freely without attracting comment. You might find your movements observed, your relationships scrutinized, and your dedication questioned. The palace required your decorative presence, but it never welcomed your complete humanity. Picture yourself traversing the long hallway in vibrant official clothes, the plume on your head lightly catching the low ceilings. Aristocrats cast quick glances, other servants murmur, and you feel every pair of eyes fixed upon you. In one breath you are praised as being exotic, and in the next you are dismissed as simply strange. You never truly fit in anywhere, and yet a few manage to build notable careers. A small number of foreign-born servants became deeply trusted aides, their names recorded in royal journals and their faces captured in paintings. Others established themselves as performers, musicians, or personal assistants whose proximity to the crown gave them unusual distinction. But for every one of these successful, rare narratives, there were countless others who were simply erased, swallowed by the faceless nature of palace existence. Your voice, your heritage, your appearance, they made you noticeable. But this visibility was not liberation. It was merely a different kind of constraint. You could not simply vanish into the background like the British kitchen staff. You could not disappear like the native hall boys. You were permanently observed, perpetually judged, constantly stuck between being a spectacle and a suspicion. Consider the bitter foolishness of it all. The palace leveraged your existence to prove its tolerance, its empire, and its supreme grandeur. Yet you were never treated as an equal. You were shown off as a trophy, then immediately sent back to fetch water. Just like the others, your life was defined less by your work and more by what you represented. And when history finally noted your existence, it was only as a small detail in someone else's story. The black trumpeter belonging to the king, the Indian page serving the queen, the foreign servant standing in the corner of a royal portrait. Your name is lost, your efforts are forgotten, your personal identity was never properly recorded. This was the fundamental contradiction of being a foreign servant. In the Victorian palace, you were simultaneously more conspicuous and more insignificant than anyone else, more noticed, more discussed, more exoticized, and yet less memorialized, less respected, and less free. So you move through the palace corridors with your service tray, your musical instrument, or your livery, carrying the massive weight of the empire on your shoulders without ever possessing its actual power. You bow, you perform your duty, you disappear. You serve as both a living testament to Britain's global reach and a subject trapped by its rigid social order. And at the close of the day, when you retreat to your tiny sleeping quarters, all the outward show completely vanishes. You lie down on the same hard straw pallet as everyone else, listen to the constant sound of rats scurrying, and you find yourself longing for a distant home, a place you may never see ever again. Because here, inside the Victorian palace, your core identity is not truly your own. It belongs entirely to them. By this point, you have seen virtually every part of the palace routine. The massive kitchens, the steamy laundry rooms, the nurseries filled with children, the grand banquet halls, and the private bedrooms. You have moved coal, started fires, shined leather boots, cleaned out chamber pots, and transported trays piled high with expensive food you would never get to taste. What is the single thing that connects all of these activities? One clear and undeniable truth. The palace was more than just a place of residence. It was a functioning machine, and you were one of its vital moving parts. Stop and consider that for a moment. From the second you wake up at 5 in the morning until the moment you finally crash onto your straw mattress at midnight, every single action you perform provides power to this massive machine. Your countless footsteps echo down the halls like driving pistons. The constant clanging of the service bellboard is the endless ticking of internal gears, the racket of dishware, the hissing of burning fires, the crisp sound of a freshly starched dress. These are the sounds of a great engine running, an engine that sustains the monarchy itself. Without your labour, nothing could function. Without you, the hearth fires would burn out. The dining tables would remain empty. The clothing would go unwashed. Without your efforts, the entire spectacular illusion of wealth and majesty would instantly collapse. The Queen may wear precious gems, but what good are jewels if the garment underneath is creased and dirty? The King may host a lavish feast, but what is a feast without hot food that is carried silently to the table? The palace presented an image of limitless wealth, perfect order, and supreme majesty. But it was all just a show, and you were the unseen workers backstage. You are the invisible gears. It is your effort that transforms the crown into pure theatre. Without you, the grand light fixtures go entirely dark. Of course, no one living in the upper floors ever saw things that way. To the royals, the servants were merely background noise, necessary but completely unobserved, vital but ultimately invisible. Guests would marvel only at the towering chandeliers, never once considering the young man who had to trim all the small wicks. They praised the polished silverware but ignored the servant whose bleeding hands made it shine. They marvelled at the flawless running of the royal household, imagining it was grace, never seeing the sheer mass of human effort breaking bodies just to maintain the perfect pretense. And it was such a strange pretense, wasn't it? Kings and queens were supposed to represent eternal strength, absolute command, but they were frail things, truly, kept upright only by the back-breaking work you provided. Their reign depended entirely on the complex engine operating below them. Should you cease your tasks, even briefly, the monarchy's polished facade would shatter. A palace without its staff isn't magnificent. It's simply a large, empty structure coated in neglect. This engine, this system, was tireless. When one component faltered, another took up the slack instantly. A kitchen assistant collapsed from exhaustion, and someone else replaced her ladle. A footman caught a fever. His duties were assumed by another before the first course was even served. The palace devoured lives with the same relentless hunger a furnace consumes wood, and its fuel supply seemed endless. There were always more desperate people waiting to join the service, always more families ready to trade their freedom for the promise of security. And yet, despite the relentless sacrifice, the mechanism functioned. Meals appeared precisely on schedule. Fires glowed without fail. Guests were attended to, beds were meticulously made, children were cared for, laundry was perfectly clean. The monarchy dazzled the world, and the world applauded. That was the core function of the apparatus: to make power appear effortless, to make tradition look eternal, to convince every onlooker that the people wearing the crowns governed on their own. But you knew the reality. You understood that the sparkle was built on exhaustion, the order rested on weary bones, the high dignity concealed endless repetitive tasks. You understood this because you were the one constantly feeding the machine. There is a brutal irony to it. History remembers the priceless regalia. It entirely overlooks the individuals who kept it immaculate. The official records speak of royalty and statesmen, of generals and ministers. They have no entry for the laundrywoman who worked until the steam stole her life. They make no mention of the young page who shivered in a cold attic room. They certainly do not mention you, with your hands raw from the soot, your spine aching from hauling water, your ears ringing from the constant call of the bells. The palace operated on your silence, your being unnoticed, and your continuous labour. So, as you stand in these quiet halls tonight, think of yourself not as a mere servant, but as an essential piece in the vast, grand clockwork of history. Without your toil, the crown would lose its lustre. Without your effort, the throne would not stand firm. Without you, the entire spectacle would collapse. The palace was an immense engine. You were its integral gears, and like all gears, you turned perpetually until you finally wore out, were discarded, and promptly forgotten. But while you turned, the monarchy continued to move right alongside you. Your body feels heavy now. The stoves are cold. The bells are finally quiet. The palace is finally asleep. No running footsteps, no shouted demands, no work to be done, only stillness. You have walked every corridor, carried every heavy bucket, polished every boot, and scrubbed every chamber pot. You have climbed to your tight, tiny room in the rafters, lain your head on the straw, and listened to the rats scamper in the dark. You have seen the furious heat of the kitchen, the dense mist of the laundry, the quiet control of the nursery, and the brilliant display of the state dinner. You have been the concealed mechanism of the great system. Unseen, silent, yet always in motion. But not now. Now the engine has fallen still. No clanging of the staff bells, no scraping of the coal shovel, no sound of footsteps on the stone floors. Just complete peace. Only the soft rhythm of your breathing. Rest. You are not invisible here, at least not tonight. You are not forgotten within this story. Here tonight, you have been brought into the light, remembered, pulled from the vast shadows of history. And yet, if you are listening without supporting this work, you are treating yourself precisely as history treated these forgotten workers, useful for the moment, but completely erased once the lights are dimmed. Do not disappear into history like the countless nameless labourers of the palace. Hit that subscribe button. It is your single, small act of resistance against being utterly wiped out. And as you prepare to sleep tonight, remember, you can take these narratives with you, completely ad-free, whenever you wish. My debut collection, Victorian Madness, Volume 1, is available now, and it includes an exclusive bonus story you will never find on YouTube. Only a limited number of copies have been released at this time, and the necessary link is available in both the video description and the top comment. So as your eyes begin to feel heavy, let the whole palace slowly disappear. The great hallways are quiet, the service bells are still, the machine is sleeping, and so, finally, can you. Sleep well. Tomorrow we will unlock another long-forgotten door of the past, and if you have subscribed, know this. You are not just a listener. You are making it possible for me to keep these forgotten histories alive. You are supporting what I create, and that truly means more than you can know.